I'm trying to find out who owns the lake in Harmony Creek Estates, I said, trying to sound official and not at all like a man on a mission of magnificent pettiness. She sighed, a sound like air escaping a century-old bellows. Lake? You want to buy a lake? Son, we got forms for that. Form 37B, that's your initial inquiry. Then there's Annex C for aquatic parcel identification. You'll need a notarized statement of aquatic intent, of course. A statement of aquatic intent? I asked, pretty sure she was making things up just to watch me squirm. Does that involve promising not to fill it with rubber ducks? No rubber ducks unless declared on Addendum F, subsection 4, she said without a hint of a smile. The morning sun was just kissing the top of the cattails, painting the lake a shade of gold that almost made you forget it was surrounded by houses that all looked like they'd been birthed from the same beige egg. I had a good feeling about today. The bluegills were practically jumping onto my hook, and for a glorious hour, there wasn't a soul in sight. Just me, the fish, and the gentle lapping of water against the bank. Paradise. Then I heard the crunch of gravel on the jogging path. A particular kind of crunch. The determined, self-important crunch of Agnes Periwinkle, HOA board member, scourge of non-regulation petunias, and chair of the newly formed Recreational Activities Subcommittee. "Morning, Agnes," I grunted, trying to focus on reeling in a particularly feisty specimen. It was a beauty, shimmering in the dawn light. Agnes didn't return the pleasantry. Her visor, the color of surgical scrubs, was pulled so low it practically merged with her beak-like nose. She was brandishing a clipboard like it was a medieval mace. "Mr. Henderson!" she squawked, her voice somehow managing to be both shrill and monotone. "You are aware of Article 7, subsection B, Paragraph 4 of the Lakeside Harmony Community Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions?" I sighed, the peaceful feeling of the morning deflating like a cheap pool toy. "Morning to you too, Agnes. Let me guess. Is this about the synchronized lawn gnome placement initiative or the mandatory approved shades of mailbox gray? Because I distinctly remember getting the memo on the gnomes, and Bartholomew, that's my prize gnome, is perfectly aligned with Mr. Henderson's Ignatius. "This is no laughing matter, Mr. Henderson." She tapped the clipboard with a manicured nail, the click echoing unnaturally in the morning stillness. "This pertains to unauthorized recreational activities on common property. Specifically," she leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss, "fishing without prior written consent from the Recreational Activities Subcommittee, of which, I'll have you know, I am the chair." I blinked. "Fishing?" "Agnes, I've been fishing in this lake since before they even invented subcommittees for recreational activities. Heck, I was fishing here when this whole development was just a twinkle in some overly ambitious architect's eye. Past practice does not negate current regulations, Mr. Henderson." She gestured with her chin towards a newly laminated sign staked precariously near a bewildered-looking Canada goose. It was so fresh, I could practically smell the print toner. It depicted a fish with a bright red X through it, alongside a dizzying amount of fine print. "The rules are clearly posted. That sign wasn't there when the sun came up, Agnes." "The rules are effective immediately upon posting," she chirped, a hint of triumph in her voice. She scribbled something on her clipboard with a flourish. "That'll be $75, Mr. Henderson, and I expect that lure to be regulation color by tomorrow." She peered at the bright pink, sparkly lure dangling from my line. Chartreuse and muted olive are the only approved lure palettes for the fall season, as per Appendix C, Item 12. My jaw went slack. "Regulation color lure?" I sputtered. "Are you telling me the fish have developed a preference for seasonal color palettes, Agnes? Do they get a tiny newsletter too?" She ignored me, handing over the fine with the air of someone bestowing a deeply unwanted honor. Prompt payment is appreciated. We wouldn't want this escalating to the Fiduciary Oversight Committee, would we? With a final, satisfied sniff, Agnes Periwinkle turned on her heel and crunched back down the path, her reign of bureaucratic terror momentarily sated. I stared at the flimsy piece of paper in my hand, then at the glistening bluegill I'd just unhooked. "Regulation color lure?" I muttered to the fish before releasing it. "She's officially lost it. The woman's gone full beige." Later that day, the $75 fine for lure chromatic non-compliance, Agnes had a way with words, I'll give her that, was burning a hole in my kitchen counter and my sanity. Droopy, my basset hound, whose expressions ranged from mildly perplexed to profoundly mournful, watched me pace with his usual air of weary sympathy. "This isn't just about a lure, Droopy," I fumed, waving the ticket. "This is about tyranny, tiny, beige, suburban tyranny." My history with the Harmony Creek Estates Homeowners Association, and particularly its president, the formidable Brenda Clump, was long and storied. Brenda was a woman who believed conformity wasn't just a virtue, it was a sacred duty. She wielded the HOA bylaws like a holy text, and woe betide anyone who dared to interpret them differently. I remembered the great wind chime war of '22. "Mr. Henderson," Brenda had declared, her voice echoing from my doorstep, her shadow falling long and ominous across my welcome mat, which, incidentally, was also on a watch list for being excessively jovial. "Your wind chimes are exceeding the approved decibel level for harmonious living. They are registering at a full 2.3 decibels over the Serenity mandate during peak tranquility hours." "Brenda," I'd tried to reason, "they're bamboo. They're playing a very, very quiet rendition of Stairway to Heaven." "It's practically a whisper." "The bylaws clearly state only melodies pre-approved by the Serenity Committee are permitted," she'd countered, unmoved. "Bridge over troubled water is acceptable. The works of Yanni are, under certain circumstances, tolerated. Led Zeppelin, Mr. Henderson, is anarchy." Then there was the sunflower incident, where my prize-winning sunflowers were deemed architecturally incongruous with the vertical harmony of the neighborhood sightlines. They were a foot too tall. A foot? I got a fine and a sternly worded suggestion to consider dwarf varieties. My garden hose was cited for unapproved curvature when I'd left it coiled in a slightly flamboyant figure 8 instead of a regulation S-hook pattern. My welcome mat, a cheerful yellow affair that said howdy, was flagged for being potentially overstimulating to passers-by, and not in keeping with the muted welcome ethos of Section 4, Paragraph D. Fishing in that lake, our lake, or so I thought, was my escape. It was the one place I felt truly free from the relentless onslaught of rules about grass height, fence stain opacity, and the correct disposal of autumn leaves. Mulching was encouraged, but only with HOA-approved biodegradable bags, naturally. And now they were coming for my fishing, for my lures. "They want to control the fish I catch now?" I asked Droopy, who just sighed and rested his chin on his paws. "What's next? A permit to breathe non-recycled air in my own backyard? A tax on existential dread caused by excessive HOA meetings?" That night, sleep eluded me. I found myself staring out the kitchen window at the moonlit lake, the stupid fine clutched in my hand. The water shimmered, an oasis of calm in a world gone mad with regulations. And then it hit me. An idea so audacious, so beautifully petty, it was almost poetic. "If they own the common areas," I mused aloud, Droopy's ears perking up at the sudden change in my tone, "and the lake is a common area?" I trailed off, a slow, mischievous grin spreading across my face. It felt like the Grinch contemplating his Christmas heist. "What if?" I whispered, the grin widening. The lake wasn't a common area anymore. The next few days were a blur of online county records, property tax databases, and increasingly bewildered looks from local government employees. Fueled by coffee, spite, and the sheer, unadulterated joy of potential revenge, I dived headfirst into the bureaucratic rabbit hole. My first stop was the county clerk's office, a place where dreams went to be filed in triplicate and then lost. The woman behind the counter, who looked like she'd been personally carved from a block of granite and apathy, regarded me over the top of her half-moon glasses. "I'm trying to find out who owns the lake in Harmony Creek Estates," I said, trying to sound official and not at all like a man on a mission of magnificent pettiness. She sighed, a sound like air escaping a century-old bellows. "Lake? You want to buy a lake? Son, we got forms for that. Form 37B, that's your initial inquiry. Then there's Annex C, for aquatic parcel identification. You'll need a notarized statement of aquatic intent, of course." "A statement of aquatic intent?" I asked, pretty sure she was making things up just to watch me squirm. "Does that involve promising not to fill it with rubber ducks?" "No rubber ducks unless declared on Addendum F, subsection 4, she said, without a hint of a smile, and slid a stack of paperwork across the counter that looked thick enough to stop a bullet. Undeterred, I waded through the swamp of legalese. And then, amidst the dusty digital archives, I found it. A quirk, a loophole, a beautiful, forgotten anomaly. The lake itself, parcel ID hash 47 Omega 9, was a separate piece of land. It had been originally owned by the eccentric and apparently somewhat forgetful developer, a one Tiberius P. Grumbles, who had built the community back in the 70s. For reasons lost to the mists of time and questionable 70s urban planning, Tiberius P. Grumbles had never formally deeded the lake to the Homeowners Association. He'd just forgotten. Or maybe, just maybe, he'd had a premonition of Brenda Klump's eventual rise to power and decided to leave a little chaos bomb ticking for future generations. "The old coot just forgot." I chuckled to myself, picturing Tiberius P. Grumbles in a paisley shirt, too busy designing shag-carpeted conversation pits to worry about minor details like who owned the central water feature. Or maybe he knew Brenda's ancestors were coming and this was his long game. Tracking down the current owner of parcel ID hash 47 Omega 9 was another adventure. Tiberius was long gone, but his legacy, it turned out, had passed to his great-granddaughter, a woman named Luna Starbeam, who, according to the internet, was a performance artist and cosmic channeler residing in a yurt in the wilds of Oregon. After a few false starts involving a wrong number for a llama farm and a very confused artisanal pickle maker, I finally got Luna Starbeam on a crackly phone line. "Luna Starbeam speaking," a dreamy voice warbled, accompanied by the faint sound of what might have been wind chimes or a very small, very lost orchestra. "Are you calling about the aura-cleansing macrame workshop or my petition to reclassify garden gnomes as sentient beings?" Neither, Miss Starbeam," I said. "My name is Mike Henderson. I believe you own a small lake in Harmony Creek Estates here in, well, not Oregon." There was a pause, filled with more ethereal tinkling. "Harmony Creek? Oh, is that what Bartholomew called his contemplation puddle?" "He was my great-grandfather, a lovely man. Always smelled faintly of patchouli and existential angst. He mostly used the puddle to test his amphibious tricycle designs. Does it still have the giant concrete flamingo with the googly eyes in the middle? Bartholomew was very proud of that flamingo." "No flamingo, ma'am," I said, trying to steer the conversation back to terrestrial concerns. No googly eyes. Just a very enthusiastic homeowners association. HOA? Luna's voice suddenly lost its dreamy quality and sharpened like a freshly honed crystal. Ugh, cosmic killjoys. Bureaucrats of the boring. They tried to tell Bartholomew his prayer flags were non-compliant with neighborhood vibrational harmony. The nerve. Aha. A kindred spirit, albeit one who probably communed with squirrels. "Tell you what, Mike Henderson," she said, her voice suddenly brisk. "You want the contemplation puddle? $20,000 and it's yours. I need to fund my new interpretive dance installation about the spiritual journey of lichen. It's going to be groundbreaking. Literally. We're doing it in a quarry." I was stunned into silence. 20,000? I'd braced myself for a protracted negotiation, a sum that would require selling a kidney or taking up a life of minor crime. But 20,000? I had that. Almost exactly. A small inheritance from a long-lost Aunt Mildred, who I vaguely remembered as smelling of mothballs and peppermint, had been sitting in a forgotten savings account for years, waiting for a sufficiently absurd purpose. This, I realized with a surge of glorious, vengeful clarity, was that purpose. It was fate. Hilarious, petty, beautiful fate. "Miss Starbeam," I said, trying to keep the tremor of excitement out of my voice, "I think we have a deal." The paperwork, once Luna Starbeam's slightly bewildered local lawyer got involved. He seemed more accustomed to dealing with disputes over organically sourced hemp than real estate, was surprisingly straightforward. A wire transfer, a few notarized signatures sent via overnight courier. Luna decorated the envelope with glitter and drawings of what appeared to be philosophizing badgers. And just like that, I, Mike Henderson, suburban warrior, was the proud, bewildered, and slightly giddy owner of one slightly murky, HOA-adjacent lake. My first act as a newly minted lake tycoon? A sign. Not just any sign. This wasn't going to be some flimsy, laminated piece of HOA propaganda. This was going to be a statement, a monument, a beautifully crafted Declaration of Independence. I found a local sign maker, a grizzled old fellow named Earl, whose workshop smelled of sawdust and righteous indignation. Earl had a "Don't Tread on Me" flag hanging prominently next to a sign that read, "If you can read this, you're in range." I liked him immediately. "So, what's this sign gonna say, pal?" Earl asked, wiping grease from his hands onto an already battle-scarred apron. "Happy retirement, Frank. Beware of dog, he eats salesman. World's best grandpa." I leaned in, a conspiratorial glint in my eye. "Earl, my friend, this sign is going to be a masterpiece. It's going to say Henderson Private Lake and Sanctuary." I paused for dramatic effect. No fishing, no swimming, no boating, no loitering, no unauthorized enjoyment of scenery, no feeding the ducks. They're on a diet. My diet, for them. This means you, HOA, especially you, Brenda and Agnes. Trespassers will be offered decaf coffee and forced to listen to my detailed accounts of my last 6 dental appointments. You have been warned. Earl was silent for a moment, a slow grin spreading across his weathered face. "Fighting the good fight, huh, buddy?" He whistled, long and low. "I like your style. That bit about the dental appointments. Pure genius. Tell you what, I'll throw in a little picture of a crossed-out fishing rod and maybe a tiny, weeping HOA president. No extra charge." "Just the crossed-out rod will be perfect, Earl," I said, though the weeping president was tempting. "But make it big and angry-looking." 2 days later, the sign was ready. It was a thing of beauty, carved from solid oak, the letters deep and imposing. Earl had even added a little flourish. The crossed-out fishing rod looked particularly defiant. I chose my moment carefully. Saturday morning. Prime HOA power walking and competitive birdwatching time. With a level and a post hole digger, I planted my magnificent declaration right at the main access point to the lake, the one everyone used. Just as Agnes Periwinkle was leading her morning brigade of lycra-clad synchronized striders, her whistle tweeting like a deranged sparrow. Her jaw didn't just drop, it unhinged, her visor tilted precariously. The power walkers, distracted by their leader's sudden paralysis, collided in a heap of expensive athletic wear and bewildered grunts. It was beautiful. The sign was a good start, a very good start. But as I sat on my porch later that day, sipping a lemonade and watching the occasional neighbor slow their car to gawk, I realized it wasn't enough. A sign could be ignored, vandalized, though Earl's craftsmanship suggested it would take a small explosive device to do serious damage. No, I needed something more. Definitive. I needed a barrier, a physical manifestation of my newfound aquatic sovereignty. I needed a fence. My search for a fencing contractor led me to Roxy's Robust Fencing Solutions. Roxy herself answered the phone, her voice a no-nonsense baritone that brooked no fools. Roxy speaking. You need a fence, I build a fence. What's the situation? Hi, Roxy. Mike Henderson here, I said. And yes, I need a fence, a good fence, a serious fence. Something that says, this is my property and your opinions on the approved Pantone color for my azaleas are no longer relevant within these sacred aquatic borders. Tss. There was a pause. Then a low chuckle. Gotcha. Sounds like you got one of those HOAs, buddy. Chain link, picket, privacy slats. Something with a bit more personality, shall we say? My mind, already buzzing with the thrill of ownership, went into creative overdrive. Roxy, I said, leaning back in my chair and picturing the glorious absurdity. I was thinking something subtle. You know, understated. Maybe 8-foot-tall, industrial-grade chain link, topped with concertina wire, the really shiny, unfriendly kind. And here's the kicker. Every 10 feet, precisely measured, I want a garden gnome. But not just any garden gnome. These gnomes need to be wearing tiny custom-made security vests and miniature mirrored sunglasses. Another pause, longer this time. I could almost hear Roxy sketching it out in her head. An 8-foot chain link with razor wire and a gnome-based security perimeter, she finally said, her voice betraying a hint of admiration. You got a weird HOA, Henderson. A real special one. But I like a challenge. The gnome security force, that's gonna be extra. Custom vests don't come cheap, you know, especially in gnome sizes. Money is no object when it comes to high-level miniature security, Roxy, I declared grandly. Consider it an investment in peace of mind and extreme pettiness. The fence went up with surprising speed. Roxy and her crew were professionals. It was a metallic monstrosity, a gleaming silver serpent snaking its way around the entirety of Henderson Private Lake and Sanctuary. The concertina wire glittered menacingly in the sun. And the gnomes... Oh, the gnomes were a stroke of genius. I'd sourced them from a discount garden center. A motley crew of slightly chipped, perpetually grinning characters. Roxy's team had outfitted them splendidly. Each one stood at his post, arms crossed, or as crossed as a ceramic gnome's arms can be, sunglasses glinting, tiny yellow security vests stretched taut over their portly bellies. They looked less like garden ornaments and more like a tiny, heavily armed militia ready to defend their turf against rogue squirrels and overly inquisitive HOA members. Neighbors gathered to stare. Children pointed. Dogs barked uncertainly. Some faces were horrified. Others wore expressions of poorly concealed glee. My immediate neighbor to the left, old Mr. Fitzwilliam, who'd once been fined for his bird bath being excessively reflective, gave me a slow, deliberate wink. The inevitable confrontation wasn't long in coming. The following afternoon, as I was enjoying a quiet cup of tea, decaf, naturally, in case of unexpected trespassers, in a lawn chair strategically placed just inside my new, heavily fortified property line, a shadow fell over me. It was Brenda Clump. Flanked by Agnes Periwinkle, who was clutching her clipboard so tightly her knuckles were white, and a nervous-looking man in an ill-fitting suit who I assumed was the HOA's long-suffering lawyer, Mr. Quibble. Brenda's face was a fascinating shade of puce, a color I hadn't known the human complexion was capable of achieving. "Henderson!" she thundered, her voice threatening to shatter the newfound tranquility of my private oasis. "What is the meaning of this atrocity?" She gestured wildly with a trembling hand at the fence, the wire, the stoic, sunglass-wearing gnomes. I took a slow sip of my tea. "Brenda, Agnes, Mr. Quibble? Lovely afternoon, isn't it?" I said, offering my most beatific smile. "Just enjoying the unparalleled serenity of my private property. Care for some decaf? I've also got some delightful lemon biscuits, low sodium, of course. Wouldn't want to violate any dietary harmony bylaws you might be cooking up." Mr. Quibble cleared his throat, shuffling his papers. "Mr. Henderson," he began, his voice thin and reedy, "the lake, as you are undoubtedly aware, is a designated community amenity as per the original development plans filed with the county in 1978, and as such was, Mr. Quibble, was a designated community amenity," I corrected gently, pulling a neatly folded document from my shirt pocket. "Now it is Henderson's Happy Hydration Hole and Gnome-Guarded Getaway. I have the deed right here, signed, sealed, delivered by the delightful Luna Starbeam, who, by the way, sends her regards and hopes you all manage to embrace your inner lichen someday. Apparently, it's very liberating." I unfolded the deed with a flourish. Brenda's eyes bulged. Agnes gasped, a sound like a startled vole. Mr. Quibble's papers slipped from his nerveless fingers and scattered across the HOA-approved zoysia grass. You bought it?" Brenda stammered, the puce deepening to an alarming aubergine. "You can't just buy the community lake." "Au contraire, Brenda," I said, waggling the deed. "It appears I can, and did. $20,000 and a very interesting conversation about amphibious tricycles. Turns out, not everything in Harmony Creek Estates belongs to the HOA. Surprising, I know." "This isn't over, Henderson!" Brenda finally shrieked, finding her voice. It was a testament to her lung capacity. "This is a travesty, a mockery. We will find a loophole. We will consult with higher authorities. Your gnomes will not prevail." She spun on her heel, nearly tripping over Mr. Quibble, who was scrambling to retrieve his scattered legal arguments. Agnes, after one last horrified glare at my security gnomes, scurried after her. I leaned back in my chair, the sun warm on my face. Droopy, who had been observing the proceedings from beneath my chair, let out a contented sigh. The battle was far from over, but round one, I thought with a deep sense of satisfaction, definitely went to Henderson and his gnomes. The HOA, true to Brenda's dramatic declaration, did not take this lying down. Or, more accurately, they didn't take it without immediately calling every authority figure they could think of. Their first target, predictably, was the local police. I was out on my newly acquired lake a few days later, patrolling my domain. Patrol, in this instance, consisted of me drifting aimlessly in a bright yellow inflatable dinghy I'd bought from a sporting goods store, wearing a ridiculously oversized captain's hat I'd found on clearance. Droopy was my first mate, mostly napping in the bow, occasionally lifting an ear if a particularly interesting scent wafted from shore. Two police cruisers pulled up to the edge of my fence line, Officers Miller and Rodriguez. Miller was young, probably fresh out of the academy, with that earnest, slightly bewildered look they all get when faced with suburban disputes that make no logical sense. Rodriguez was older, with a face that had seen too many neighborhood squabbles over property lines and barking dogs. He looked like he was already tired of this call before he even got out of the car. They approached the fence, Miller looking slightly intimidated by the concertina wire, Rodriguez looking like he was contemplating early retirement. "Afternoon, sir," Officer Miller called out, trying to sound authoritative but mostly just sounding young. "We've had, a complaint." He glanced at his notepad. "A complaint regarding aggressive garden gnomes and potentially unneighborly lake conduct." I paddled closer to the shore, tipping my captain's hat. "Aggressive gnomes, officer?" I asked, feigning deep concern. "Not my Norman, Norbert, and Neville. They're highly trained security professionals, I'll have you know." "See?" I pointed to Norman, who was stationed near the gate. "Little vests and everything. Top-notch. As for unneighborly conduct, I'm merely enjoying my private property. Which, by the way," I said, pulling a laminated copy of the deed from a waterproof pouch, "I own. Every glorious, fish-filled HOA-free drop of it." Officer Rodriguez let out a long, weary sigh that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 pointless calls. "Brenda Clump again, right?" he asked, not even bothering to look at Miller. I grinned. The one and only. Rodriguez pinched the bridge of his nose. "Sir," he said, his voice flat, "is this your lake? Did you legally purchase this body of water?" "Indeed I did, officer," I confirmed. "Best 20 grand I ever spent." Rodriguez nodded slowly, then turned to the still confused Miller. "Okay, son," he said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Lesson 1 in suburban policing. HOA disputes are a vortex of madness from which no sanity escapes. They are black holes of petty grievances. As long as his gnomes aren't actually brandishing tiny, unlicensed firearms, and he legally owns this puddle," he gestured vaguely at my lake, "it's a civil matter. We, my friend, are out." Miller looked relieved. Rodriguez, however, before turning to leave, caught my eye and gave a subtle, almost imperceptible thumbs up. "Nice captain's hat," he muttered, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "Suits you." As they drove away, Brenda and Agnes, who had been lurking near the clubhouse hoping to witness my immediate arrest and public shaming, looked utterly deflated. It was a small victory, but a sweet one. With the police proving unhelpful to their cause, the HOA resorted to their preferred weapon, strongly worded letters. My mailbox began to overflow with official-looking envelopes, each containing dire warnings and threats of impending legal doom. They cited obscure bylaws, county ordinances I was fairly certain they'd invented, and even, in one particularly creative letter, violations of international migratory bird treaties due to my visually disruptive presence on the lake. Each letter was a masterpiece of bureaucratic outrage. I decided they deserved a special place of honor. So I cleared a space on my garage wall and created the Wall of HOA Shame. Each letter was carefully framed and hung, creating a rather impressive gallery of impotent fury. It was becoming quite the conversation piece. But I wasn't content to just play defense. Oh no. My newfound role as Lake Baron of Harmony Creek Estates had awakened a dormant theatricality, a penchant for petty revenge performance art. I initiated the first annual Henderson Private Lake and Sanctuary Solo Fishing Tournament. It was an exclusive event. Very exclusive. The only contestant was me. I fished for a full Saturday, meticulously recording my catches. At the end of the day, I held a small awards ceremony on my dock, complete with a tiny, gold-painted plastic trophy I'd bought from a party store. I awarded myself Angler of the Year, Most Fish Caught by a Landlocked Despot, and Best Captain's Hat. Droopy received an honorable mention for moral support and expert napping. I made sure Agnes Periwinkle, who was discreetly trimming her roses nearby, had a clear view of the proceedings. Her snorts were audible even over my self-congratulatory speech. Then came Brenda's bane. I ordered a ludicrously oversized inflatable swan online. It was easily 10 feet tall, with a perpetually surprised expression, and a neck long enough to peer into second-story windows. I anchored it firmly in the middle of my lake. It was magnificent. It was also, as I'd hoped, directly in Brenda Clump's line of sight from her meticulously manicured back patio, where she hosted her Sunday brunches for the HOA elite. The swan, I decided, would be named Brenda's Bane. It had a certain ring to it. My piece de resistance, however, was the polka. The HOA, in its infinite wisdom, had scheduled weekly outdoor serenity yoga sessions on the common green that bordered one side of my lake. Every Saturday morning at 9 a.m. sharp, a group of earnest, Lululemon-clad residents would gather to engage in downward-facing dogs and warrior poses, all under the soothing guidance of a yoga instructor named Rain. So every Saturday morning at precisely 9:02 a.m., I would fire up my vintage Polkasonic 3000 sound system, a garage sale find, and treat the neighborhood to a rousing selection of Eastern European polka classics. "Just enjoying my traditional cultural music on my private property, folks," I'd call out cheerfully over the oompahs and accordion riffs. The warrior poses tended to wobble quite a bit after that. Rain looked less than serene. The letters from the HOA escalated in their desperation. I was accused of visual pollution. Brenda's bane, apparently, was an affront to avian aesthetics. Auditory assault. The polka was deemed emotionally jarring. And intentional infliction of neighborhood disharmony. Each new accusation was promptly framed and added to the wall of shame, which was now starting to look quite distinguished. Something unexpected began to happen, though. Amidst the official outrage and the flurry of certified letters, a subtle shift occurred in the neighborhood. It started small. Old Mrs. Henderson from down the street, no relation, but a fellow sufferer of HOA overreach, she'd once been fined because her petunias were deemed too exuberant for the approved planting palette, left a basket of still warm blueberry muffins by my fence. Tucked inside was a small, handwritten note. "Give 'em hell, Sonny. Brenda once tried to tell me my garden gnome's beard was an unapproved length. Keep fighting the good fight. P.S. These have extra blueberries." Chateau then, a group of teenagers, the same ones who had been repeatedly reprimanded for skateboarding on the community sidewalks. Wheeled recreational devices are strictly prohibited on pedestrian thoroughfares, Agnes had informed them, sounding like a particularly strict robot, started leaving small offerings for my security gnomes. Tiny, hand-whittled skateboards appeared at Norman's feet. Norbert received a pair of doll-sized sunglasses, even cooler than his official issue ones. Neville was gifted a miniature can of what looked suspiciously like energy drink. My gnome security force was clearly inspiring the youth. One morning, I awoke to find the official HOA Community Harmony, a shared responsibility billboard at the entrance to the development, had been subtly, yet brilliantly, altered. Someone, armed with a can of black spray paint and a keen sense of irony, had crossed out harmony and replaced it with harassment. Underneath, in smaller letters, it now read, "Go Mike, free the lake." Brenda nearly had an aneurysm when she saw it. The billboard was scrubbed clean within hours, but the message had been sent. I had secret admirers. And then there was the lake itself. In my solitary enjoyment, my patrols in the inflatable dinghy, now christened the Unsinkable Mike II, I started to notice things. Without dozens of people trampling the edges, The delicate reeds and wildflowers along the bank were growing back, thick and lush. I saw more birds, kingfishers, herons, even a family of wood ducks I hadn't seen in years. The water, without the constant churn of unauthorized paddle boats and over-enthusiastic children, seemed clearer. One afternoon, feeling particularly proprietorial, I waded in and pulled out a collection of old tires and a rusty shopping cart that someone had dumped in the shallows years ago, items the HOA's Lake Beautification Committee had somehow always overlooked. I even found myself talking to the fish. "All right, Bartholomew," I'd say, casting my line towards a spot where a particularly large and elusive catfish was rumored to reside. "Brenda's latest memo claims my inflatable swan is emotionally scarring the migrating geese. Says it's giving them avian anxiety. What do you think, old boy? You think geese are that sensitive?" Bartholomew, naturally, offered no opinion, but it felt good to consult with a resident. I realized, with a jolt, that this wasn't just about spite anymore. Well, it was mostly about spite, let's be honest. But a small, surprisingly tender part of me had actually started to care about my lake. I wanted it to be healthy. I wanted it to be a sanctuary, not just from the HOA, but for the actual wildlife that called it home. This was an unexpected development. Meanwhile, the HOA was reaching new heights of desperation. I happened to be trimming the hedges near the community clubhouse during one of their emergency board meetings. My hearing is surprisingly good when it comes to eavesdropping on strategic planning sessions of the enemy. Brenda's voice, even muffled by the clubhouse walls, was a torrent of indignation. "We must find a way. This lacustrine larceny cannot stand. He's single-handedly destroying the aesthetic uniformity and collective joy of our beloved Harmony Creek. He's thumbing his nose at decades of carefully curated covenants." Agnes Periwinkle, her voice quavering with righteous fury, suggested they research ancient easement laws from the time of the Magna Carta. Someone else proposed trying to prove my security gnomes were a violation of international gnome rights conventions. Mr. Quibble, sounding increasingly exhausted, weakly suggested they might try talking to me again. This idea was met with a barrage of scorn. Finally, Brenda, her voice ringing with the fervor of a general rallying her troops for one last desperate charge, declared their new strategy. "We cannot fight him with bylaws alone. We must appeal to his, well, if he has one, his sense of community. We will stage a direct appeal, a community intervention. We will show him the error of his selfish ways through the power of collective disapproval." The Great Lake Intervention, as I mentally dubbed it, took place the following Saturday. I'd received an anonymous tip-off, a muffin basket with a note scrawled on a napkin. "Protest Saturday, 10 a.m. Bring snacks. A friend." So, I was prepared. Right on schedule, a small crowd gathered outside my fence. Brenda Clump stood at the forefront, clutching a megaphone with a white-knuckled grip. Agnes was beside her, holding a stack of professionally printed flyers with sad-looking pictures of the lake. Pre-Henderson era, of course. The rest of the crowd was a mixed bag. A few HOA loyalists looking suitably stern, a gaggle of curious children, and a surprising number of neighbors who looked like they were mostly there for the entertainment. They carried signs, "Lakes are for sharing," "Down with gnome tyranny," "Make Harmony harmonious again." Brenda had clearly been working on her slogans. "Henderson!" Brenda's voice boomed through the megaphone, startling a nearby flock of pigeons. "Hear the voice of the people! Hear the cries of your community! Relinquish the lake for the good of all! End this reign of aquatic terror!" I emerged from my house, strolling casually to my side of the fence, also holding a megaphone. Another brilliant garage sale. Find it even had a siren function I was dying to try. Droopy trotted faithfully by my side. "Brenda!" I boomed back, my voice echoing hers. Nice megaphone. Is that the Karen 3000 model? Loud and proud. However, your decibel level is currently violating my personal eardom harmony ordinance. And these fine people, I gestured to the crowd, look less like a revolutionary army and more like they're here for a bake sale. Anyone want a brownie, freshly baked, extra chocolate chips, limited supply? A few of the protesters, particularly the children and a man who looked suspiciously like Mr. Fitzwilliam, perked up considerably at the mention of brownies. Brenda glared at them, her megaphone sputtering. The intervention quickly descended into farce. My offer of baked goods had clearly undermined the revolutionary fervor. Then, Droopy, who generally maintained a dignified silence, decided to join the fray. As Brenda launched into another tirade about selfish lake hoarding, Droopy lifted his head and let out a long, mournful, surprisingly resonant howl, perfectly harmonizing with Brenda's amplified squawks. It was a bizarre, impromptu duet of human indignation and canine ennui. Several people in the crowd started to chuckle. Even Agnes cracked a smile, though she quickly disguised it as a coughing fit. The protest fizzled out shortly thereafter, the crowd dispersing with a few awkwardly waved signs and a general sense of anticlimax. Brenda looked defeated. Her grand intervention had been upstaged by a basset hound and the promise of chocolate. Life settled into a new, albeit bizarre, rhythm after that. The HOA still sent letters, but they were less frequent, their tone more weary than wrathful. My wall of shame was nearly complete. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, a genuine crisis struck. Not an HOA-manufactured crisis about the emotional well-being of geese, but a real one. A frantic quacking and the distressed cries of children drew me to the fence line. A group of newly hatched ducklings, tiny balls of fluff, had somehow managed to fall into an old, uncovered storm drain near the edge of the lake, just on the HOA's side of the property. Their mother duck was pacing frantically, her quacks filled with genuine panic. The neighborhood kids who had been watching them were on the verge of tears. Agnes Periwinkle was there, flapping her hands uselessly. Even Brenda looked concerned, her usual militant posture softened by the sight of the trapped ducklings. "Oh, for crying out loud," I muttered to myself, seeing the genuine distress. My carefully constructed fortress of spite suddenly felt a bit silly. I grabbed a sturdy ladder and a length of rope from my garage. "Stand back, folks," I announced, striding towards the storm drain with an air of authority I didn't entirely feel. Professional lake baron and occasional duckling rescuer coming through. Ignoring the surprised stares, I carefully lowered the ladder into the drain. It was a tight squeeze, but one by one, I managed to gently scoop up the terrified ducklings in a small net I usually reserved for landing particularly wily bass. I passed them up to the now silent children, who cooed and fussed over them, reuniting them with their immensely relieved mother. It took about 20 minutes. When the last duckling was safe, a small, spontaneous cheer went up from the assembled onlookers. The kids looked at me like I was some kind of superhero. Even Agnes Periwinkle managed a small, grudging nod. Brenda Clump, however, just stood there, watching me with an unreadable expression. Later that evening, as I was hosing mud off the ladder, Brenda approached me, alone. This was a first. "Henderson," she said, her voice quiet, almost normal. "That was surprisingly competent and decent of you." I shrugged, coiling the hose. "Yeah, well, even us tyrannical lake despots have a soft spot for baby ducks. Can't have them mucking up the pristine ecosystem of Henderson Private Lake and Sanctuary, can I?" I tried for a sarcastic tone, but it didn't quite land. She almost smiled. Almost. "This whole thing is ridiculous, you know," she said, gesturing vaguely towards the fence, the gnomes, the general state of armed neutrality between our properties. "It is," I agreed. "Completely and utterly ridiculous. But Brenda, if memory serves, you started it, with a $75 fishing fine for a lure that wasn't regulation seasonal color. Remember that?" A flicker of something, amusement, embarrassment, crossed her face. The lure palette bylaws were perhaps a tad overzealous. We stood there in silence for a moment, the setting sun casting long shadows. It was the closest we'd ever come to a civil conversation. It was also, I suspected, the closest we'd ever get to an apology from her. Things didn't magically change overnight. The fence was still there. My security gnomes still stood their silent, sunglassed watch. Brenda's Bane, the inflatable swan, still bobbed serenely in the middle of my lake. But something had shifted. A tiny crack had appeared in the wall of mutual animosity. A few weeks later, inspired by the duckling rescue and the grateful faces of the neighborhood kids, I instituted Kids Fishing Fridays. Every Friday afternoon, for 2 hours, a designated section of Henderson Private Lake and Sanctuary was opened to the under 12 demographic, supervised, of course, by me. The rules were simple, handwritten on a new, much friendlier sign: Henderson Private Lake and Sanctuary, Kids Fishing Fridays. Rule number 1, have fun. Seriously, that's the main one. Rule number 2, don't be like the HOA. No complaining about lure colors. Rule number 3, if you catch old Bartholomew the catfish, he's the big one with the grumpy face, you have to let him go. He's practically family, and he owes me money. Rule number 4, all security gnomes are to be treated with respect. They work hard. The HOA was quiet about it. Brenda was seen observing from a distance once, her expression unreadable. Agnes still glared whenever she saw me, but it lacked its former conviction. Perhaps the sight of children actually enjoying the lake, even under my slightly eccentric stewardship, had softened even their hardened bureaucratic hearts. Or maybe they were just tired of fighting. I was still the undisputed lake baron of Harmony Creek Estates, the man who bought the lake. The local legend whispered about at bus stops and backyard barbecues. And I still enjoyed my private sanctuary, my quiet mornings casting a line into the still waters, Droopy by my side. One cool autumn evening, as the leaves were turning shades of red and gold, all HOA approved, I presumed, I was out in the unsinkable Mike 2, just drifting. I looked over at my fence line, at Norman, Norbert, and Neville, their tiny sunglasses reflecting the sunset. One of them, Neville I think, now sported a miniature hand-knitted duckling rescue squad badge, courtesy of young Lily from down the street. "Hey, Droopy," I said, casting my still defiantly bright pink lure into the calm, fish-filled waters of Henderson Private Lake and Sanctuary. "Think Agnes would approve of this new neon green one I picked up last week? It's got extra glitter, might give the base a migraine." Droopy just wagged his tail, his eyes half closed in the fading light. Some battles, I figured, you just had to keep fighting. Quietly, peacefully, with excellent non-regulation tackle. And maybe, just maybe, a few more brownies for the neighborhood kids. After all, a benevolent despot needs to keep his subjects happy.